Good day, I'm Mahdi Rouhiathar, an English lecturer teaching at College of Applied Sciences, Salalah, Oman. Actually, I want to report on a kind of study done a few years ago. It was a sort of attempt to develop a grammar learning use strategy questionnaire based on different models and frameworks. So it actually formed a theoretical sort of foundation for this study. So you can see my own picture. Actually, I've got more than 30 years of experience teaching English as a foreign language across different proficiency levels in different educational settings. And one of my areas of interest is actually related to self-regulation and language learning strategies. And this sort of endeavor, this study is actually focusing on one of the areas of language learning strategies. So let us go to that domain, language learning strategies, and have a sort of review of what actually we have in the literature. So actually the beginning of the history concerning language learning strategies quite related to two sorts of interests actually caused by two kinds of movement. One of them is related to teaching. Actually there was a shift of, let's say, interest from the teaching to the learner. So when we focus on the learner, actually we are just going to tackle the processes the learner is just going through in order to learn the language. So one of the things that the learner is just doing is just to resort to language learning strategies. And the other one is related to the theoretical, let's say, foundation. Actually competence was defined differently. So at the beginning we focused on grammatical competence. Later on we resorted to communicative competence as the real sort of competence that the learners should try just to have. So these two things actually, as you can see in the list, caused a kind of, let's say, attention paid to language learning strategies. The concept is quite difficult to define as of its, let's say, abstract nature. So there is a kind of, doubt about how we should define it. So there have been many definitions when you go through the history, but actually when you just, let's say, review the literature, you may come across a list of some essential, let's say, features of the idea. As you can see it here, these are related to actions, consciousness, context-dependent option, goal orientation, self-regulation, and the facilitation of learning. When it comes to research in language learning strategies, we have different areas. We have different areas. So one of these areas that I focus on in the present study is just related to the development of a kind of taxonomy. So if you just see that list at the bottom of this slide, you can see three different areas which have been researched. One of them is the taxonomies of strategies. The other one, the factors which can influence the strategy use. And one of them is related to a sort of intervention, let's say, interventional kind of study related to how the treatment with a focus on the strategies can affect students' performance. So let us just quickly go to the other slide. So here you can see a very brief review of the literature. And again, when we just review the related literature, actually, we come across the kinds of controversy regarding the definition. Maybe one of the most prominent features criticizing the idea of language learning strategy was Dornier, along with Skihan 2003. And, as a reaction to this, again, some features were suggested to define language learning strategies. So we have a sort of composite definition. But Oxford actually was the key feature here, reformulating her earlier, let's say, definition of language learning strategies and try to include the idea of self-regulation. So here we have just the beginning of that kind of, let's say, revolution in defining language learning strategies. And, that just gave us a sort of hint to one of the models I drew in order just to develop my questionnaire here. And that is called strategic self-regulated learning or model of learning. And it consists of different kinds of strategies: cognitive, affective, social, cultural, interactive strategies. At the same time, something which is quite interesting is that it tries to add two more meta strategies. Formerly we had metacognitive strategies, but here we have two other kinds of meta strategies related to affective factors and related to social, cultural, and interactive factors. So this is one of the models I resorted to in order to develop my questionnaire. So as you can see, the new model developed by Oxford 2016. Of course, originally it was written in 2011, but actually the new version of the book was published in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. So you can see the addition of meta strategies and the idea of self-regulation to the earlier model suggested by Rebecca Oxford. Let us go to the other slide. Again, I should quickly go through this slide because of lack of time. So here you can see the definition of grammar learning strategies. And, actually, when we go through the studies done in the area, we can see a sort of noticeable gap. So that is the sort of gap I just tried to target. So it is quite surprising that, we have lots of attention paid to strategies across different skills. I mean, listening, reading, writing, speaking, even vocabulary. But when it comes to grammar, it was totally disregarded. And that just triggered the idea, I just tried just to see how I can develop a sort of grammar learning strategy. So there are several theoretical positions influencing grammar learning strategies. Actually, you can just see them, but maybe the beginning was that kind of scholarly attempt by Rubin, and then you can just see the other ones. But another sort of, let's say, framework I resorted to, to develop this questionnaire is related to, the classification. I mean, the last part of this slide, the classification of grammar learning strategies as a function of its instructional mode. You can find it by, that book, that great book written by Makarov, sorry. Cohen and Makarov. So in 2007, just Oxford introduced the ideas of instructional modes, which actually formed one of the theoretical frameworks to develop grammar learning strategies. So, the earlier model, as you can see, had a sort of cognitive orientation. I mean, the one developed in 1990 by Oxford had a sort of cognitive orientation, didn't cover other meta strategies, and it didn't cover, let's say, self-regulation. So, again, here we have the report of different studies concerning grammar learning. So very few studies focus on grammar strategies, in spite of its importance. So when you review the studies, you know, the scarcity of the studies, paucity of the studies, so you come to this conclusion that, okay, there is a sort of urgent need for future research to develop a comprehensive classification of grammar learning strategies. So this is lacking actually in our field, There are several attempts, you know, but that is not a sort of comprehensive one. I try to construct a valid, reliable data collection tool with a learner-centered rather than teacher-centered perspective. And this was actually the idea behind this study. So let me just go to what was significant about this study. Actually, I want to say the problem. So I tried to develop a kind of questionnaire which can include all kinds of grammar strategies you can resort to. So that is the reason why, as you can see it in this slide, I had 5 major sources. One of them, mentioned earlier, belonged to Oxford, instruction modes of, let's say, teaching. I mean, explicit, implicit, there's, such dichotomies in explicit, implicit, something like that. And then Oxford's strategic self-regulated model of learning. And what would that scholarly attempt by Lawson Freeman, that, let's say, magical framework presented by her, I mean that three-dimensional model covering form, meaning, and use. So I resort to this one too. I just went through different, let's say, taxonomies which were developed for other skills. So I try to find their strategies which are related to grammar. So this was again another one. At that time, I found 2 very good books which dealt with, let's say, grammar strategies in forms of different lessons, kind of series of course books. So they were written by Briggs. Written 1994, series of 2 books. So I found some good strategies which were task specific. So this was another, let's say, framework. So so the basic question was this. I just tried to propose a grammar learning user strategy model. So the basic question is related to the idea whether this sort of model fits the data well or not. So actually we've got some follow-up questions clearly. So one of the, those 5 questions are related to the 5 constituents. One of them related to instructional modes of grammar learning. The other one related to self-regulated model of language learning. The third one is actually concerned with the strategies in language skills. and the strategies for the other one is related, sorry, let's say are related to form, meaning, and use. And the last question is related to those strategies I found in that, I mean, those books written by Briggs, kind of task-based grammar learning strategy. So actually, the major question and the follow-up questions are related to, let's say, fitness. Good, actually, whether the model fits the data well or not. So let's go to methodology, and it begins with the design of the study, which is of quantitative type, clearly, and the procedure actually began with the development of, let's say, an item pool on the basis of these frameworks I discussed. Then I tried to prepare the first version of the instrument. I had, for example, expert idea. I just piloted that one, and based on that pilot study, I designed, the final version, and it went through sort of complicated statistical procedure. I mean, that one which you are quite familiar with when you want to develop a kind of question, exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis. So mm, let's discuss participants. So actually the participants mainly came from different universities and high schools in Iran. And you can see the features here. Here we had the different ideas of, having a range of participants, a wide range of participants in terms of sex, age range, proficiency, and so on. So the table actually presents characteristics of the participants in the first phase. So let's have a look at the instrument in its original form, and you can see the distribution of different items across different constituents here. And the other one is actually related to the range of items which were very, which just went through kind of validation procedure, and then you can see the resultant items. So for example, if you look at the instructional modes of second language learning suggested by Oxford and Lee 2007, you can see that firstly we have 36 items, but the resultant items after that sort of validation procedure just included 12 items. So if you go through through, let's say, the other constituents, you can see the original items and then the validated items. So this table actually summarizes the instrument in its original and validated forms. So, actually, in order to collect the data, I try to resort to that wonderful book written by Donier about, administering questionnaires, developing questionnaires, something like that. So actually, when you want to develop a kind of questionnaire, the administration of the original question is quite important. You should just go through a lot of, pre-thought, um, you know, thinking, something like that, in order to ensure the reliability, actually the consistency in administering the questionnaire. So this is a long story, and you can have a sketch of that one here. So I go through the data analysis. As I told you, we had a very complicated statistical procedure. You can see a summary of that one for confirmatory, for, let's say, exploratory factor analysis. So you can see the characteristics here. Actually, when we discuss the results, we can see that, overall we had a kind of fit, you know. So the goodness of fit in the indices of the proposed general model was actually confirmed, So we had 5 constituents, and the results show that in general the model was confirmed. So that table actually shows, that kind of confirmation, the significance level, and so on. So you can see those constituents, and if you see the other slide following this one, actually you can see the basic model of grammar learning uses strategy questionnaire in terms of expected changes. There were many, resultant uh, models like this, so I could just include this one to see what's happening actually. So the results of the goodness of fit and the different indices are shown in this table, and then you can have the acceptable indices, the right side, compare it, and in general you can see that all the constituents have rather uh, good, acceptable, let's say, fit. Uh, uh, Maybe this one is actually the most important slide, because this table can give you the idea of which items were loaded, and then you can see the factors, and everything is actually summarized here. So for example, for the first model, I mean instructional modes of L2 learning, we had 36 items. You can see the loaded items in exploratory factor analysis, then the resultant, let's say, loaded items for a confirmatory factor analysis. You can see the total of each part. So this table can give you an idea about the loaded items of, let's say, the final and the initial, let's say, model. Uh, if we go to the other slides, I should just briefly talk about these ones. In general, this was a kind of study which was quite unprecedented. Actually, I tried to develop a kind of comprehensive model which was actually concerned with different kinds of, let's say, framework. So the location of the study is in the domain of language learning strategy, which was totally ignored. So it was comprehensive in the way that you can find global grammar strategies, you can find local grammar strategies, you can find general ones, you can find a hierarchy of interrelationship between observed variables and latent variables at different levels. I suppose this was a sort of first attempt to develop a very comprehensive grammar learning strategy questionnaire. So let us discuss the most important ones. This kind of questionnaire or taxonomy or inventory or whatever you may call can be of use to the learners. It can just act as a sort of consciousness raising. If they just see the items, so their awareness will be actually raised when they just go through the different items here. So that can be a kind of self-assessment instrument. A multidimensional or dimensional learner should just pay attention to all aspects of learning. Doesn't just include cognitive one, it also includes metacognitive aspects too. So this is actually what can be done with this sort of instrument. And let's go to other kinds of implication as we are pressed for the time. So the implications of teachers is that they can use this instrument in their own classes to see whether the students are aware of grammar learning strategies or not. So you can see a list of other implications. So the time is quite restricted. Let's go to the last slide actually, and I want to focus on this a bit more. Uh, this study was done in Iran, so this with that sort of samples. So this can be replicated in other places with other samples to see whether it is a sort of valid instrument or not. So you can have other samples, so that can be a good start for you to start a sort of replication study on the basis of this. And you should have, of course, much more information in future studies. So I just focus on a group of learners, so you can focus on different kinds of learners coming from different places. And when it comes to data collection, actually, there can be a kind of triangulation. I mean, you can use other techniques like oral interviews, observation, and so on. At the end, let me just thank everybody. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. And my special thanks goes to actually the organizers of the event. I wish you all the best.